Welcome back to Track Talk. Today we're going to be doing a rules overview of the newly released 1899 Daihan rules. This is the game that is the newest 18xx to come to Kickstarter for those of you who are unaware. And a lot of people have been asking to see these rules to determine whether or not to back the campaign. So we'll go through them from the perspective of an experienced 18xx player with an attention to differences with other popular games and specifically 1830 as a base rule set. So with that said, let's jump right into it. This is the 1899 Daihan map, and we will talk about some of the features of this in a few moments, but I just wanted to show you the artwork to start off. Now we'll dive into the actual rule set, and the rules are available on BoardGameGeek if you're interested in going through them. So we will skip the intro and components. They're all pretty standard and get right into setup. The setup is also, I would say, fairly standard. The setup does get into one of the game's MacGuffins early on. In this game, there are going to be commodities or goods that are transported from certain locations on the map to destinations. And it looks like the arrangement of these destinations is randomly set up during the initial board setup. So if we look at the map here, you can see these empty tokens on the offboards and then some of them on port offboards. And it looks like there will be goods tokens assigned to some portion of these empty locations, which will determine where the goods, which are these icons here on the map, can be delivered. So we'll talk about that, but just as early in the setup, there is some randomness, but after that, there's very little randomness in the rest of the game. Going back to the rule book here, the rest of setup is pretty unremarkable. You do have a little bit of randomness in the private companies. So there'll be 7 private companies in this game, and the order of 4 of them in the auction is going to be randomly determined, but you will see the same 7 private companies in each game you play. So there's pretty minimum randomness there. While we are talking about the privates, let's just jump to the end of the rulebook where we actually see what the privates are. And I will say that this part of the rulebook in particular needs more depth and explanation. This is a draft rulebook, so this is the part of the rulebook that most clearly shows that. What the privates actually are and do is very unclear. It looks from a very brief overview like there's 1 blocker private. Then there's 4 privates that are associated maybe with track laying and also probably with the goods tokens. There is 1 private with really no information at all, which I presume is just a revenue private. And then the last private seems to be perhaps the presidency of what I would call minor company, a company with maybe 50% shares. And you also get a 2 train and a token, an incheon for that private. So this private in particular, the last private, I'm not entirely sure how it functions based on the rules, and that will need to be expanded. It does look like it may give you a token in this city here, which is just outside Seoul. So potentially a good revenue location, also easy access to an offboard, and that 2 train. So potential for some good private there. And the reason I say I think it gives you this token is that when you look at the actual Kickstarter campaign, you can see that the map on the Kickstarter campaign has a token in that location, which does not correspond to any of the 8 companies. So I assume that's some kind of private or minor associated token. But we will move on here and not delve too much further into the privates. There are, I would say, 8 companies or 8 major companies in this game, similar to 1830, and they will be started in analogous ways. And then we will jump into the auction here. The auction is pretty unremarkable. You'll be going through each of these private companies that we just described in sequential order and then bidding in 5-won increments on them. So it is not a waterfall auction. You bid on each private in sequence. Stock round is fairly 1830 style stock round. It is sell by with the wrinkle that you cannot buy shares, sorry, you cannot sell shares that were bought in the current round. And that appears to be regardless of whether or not that company is operated or if it's the first time that company is being floated, it just seems like a hard, you cannot sell shares that you have bought in the current round, which I am not a huge fan of that rule, um, but it is an important thing to note. Otherwise, it looks like it's a 50% float game. It's full capitalization, and your market shares are going to pay to the company when they eventually get into the market. So very 18, I guess 1889 adjacent. One other interesting thing to note here is that the par price will determine how many tokens the company gets. So higher pars will get you an extra token, and each of those tokens is going to be $40 to lay. And then finally, as the stock round concludes, priority deal is determined by left of last action. There's no cash order priority or pass priority. Moving to the operating round, this is also fairly standard. So you will have a fixed sequence of actions for each of the companies, and the operating order will be determined in stock price as it usually is. I will say that the track construction and upgrading rules do not entirely clarify whether or not this is a permissive or semi-restrictive type game. The exact quote is that tracks may only be constructed or upgraded on locations connected to the corporation's station tokens. So that will need to be clarified whether or not you need to be actually able to run the new track or not. But again, this is a draft rule set, so I'm not going to harp on that too much. There is a small wrinkle in the trains, in the running of trains, this executive car. The executive car, unclear what it's going to cost, but it extends the range of the train by one stop, but it does not extend the number of revenue centers calculated for revenue. So you can run your 5 train as a 6, but you're still only going to get revenue from 5 of those stops. The reason why this may be useful, at least from my understanding of this rule set, is that it may make it a little bit easier for you to reach a destination for your goods. Because even if you can't count the revenue from the destination, you can still deliver goods. We've talked about the goods a little bit and how they are transported from a origin on the map to one of the off-board locations. So for instance, this, I guess this is grain, would be picked up and then potentially transported here or to any of these locations. Now, the rules are also a little bit unclear about the nature of these transports. It says something to the effect that you can transport a good with multiple trains, provided you follow all the other operation rules. And whether that means that you can daisy chain trains together to transport a good is unclear, or if it just means that you can have multiple trains running in different parts of the map transporting multiple goods. I'm going to assume that it is probably the second, in the sense that you could have one train, running up here transporting gold, and then a second train running through a separate token down here, transporting, for instance, ore. However, the way it's written currently does leave it open to the interpretation that you could run, one train from the offboard through this good, and then have a second train running from this token up to this offboard to transport this good as a daisy chain. Unclear if that's the case, but I just want to highlight for the rules authors that really needs to be cleaned up in how it's worded. The only other interesting part about the operating round in trains is that you have a 1830 style diesel train, which you can see here. And when you buy that, you get a stock bump for the purchasing company. That is only if you buy this legitimately, i.e., not through emergency fundraising. So that gives the diesel train a little bit of a bonus. Diesels are sometimes not the most appealing purchase, so this stock bump may make that a little bit of a less bitter pill to swallow. There is also a diesel train upgrade, very similar to the 1830 style of upgrade. I will note that the train roster is potentially mildly different from 1830. So if we look on the map here, it says that there are two six trains, but if we look in the rules in the phase table or chart, there is apparently only one six train. So that may be a typo. I would assume that there are going to be two six trains, but that may be a small departure. Otherwise, the phases and the effects in this game that are triggered by the advancing train roster are basically analogous to the 1830 style. So the privates can be purchased after the 3 train comes out, 5 trains close the privates, etc. And all the rusting events are analogous as well. Even the number of operating rounds in between stock rounds corresponds to the train roster in the same way. We will go back for a second to look at the emergency fundraising rules. The only thing I want to point out here is that it's unclear to me if you can dump a presidency during emergency fundraising. It says that you may not sell enough shares to lose control of the corporation, which I assume means that the company that is emergency fundraising a train cannot be sold down or dumped, which would be very standard. But it does not specify whether or not you can dump a second company or a third company on other players during this process as a result of your stock sales. Some games allow that, which is, I think, a fun mechanism, and then other games specifically disallow any presidency change during emergency fundraising. So this rulebook does not draw that distinction currently, but hopefully will before it's published. Finally, just looking at the end game triggers, the end game is going to occur immediately upon bankruptcy, and then the bank breaking or the purchase of a D train will trigger the end of the game at the end of the current set of operating rounds. So it's basically immediately with bankruptcy or at the end of the current set of operating rounds. There is no market value trigger for the end game. It's solely based on the bank or train roster. So that is a little bit of a departure from other style games where there would be a square here at the end of the market that could trigger the end game. As a final note, just while we're concluding this video, I do want to point out that the stock market appears fairly shallow and simplified. So there are no yellow or orange zones. It doesn't appear there's any exceptions to the certificate limit or stock owning limits is a part of this game. The market also appears fairly linear with basically $5 jumps or multiple of $5 jumps. There's no interesting values like 67 as a par, for instance. And it looks like as you move to the right, the stock appreciation is very uniform, where the different rows tend to appreciate at basically the same rates as you move to the right. So not the most interesting stock market, and doesn't appear to be a big bottom zone of the market for your company to be trashed in, which may mean this is a little bit of a gentler experience than other games. All right, so we've really covered the rules and their differences from 1830. I think in summary, this is a pretty low chrome game. There are 2 MacGuffins with the goods and then with the executive cars. But other than that, I think you can expect a fairly standard 1830 type experience. Whether or not the game actually ends up playing like 1830, of course, is really something that we would have to wait to play test and determine, how the map feels. It's hard to get a good sense of that based on just going through the rulebook, but definitely not a Chrome heavy game. So I hope this was helpful, and please consider, supporting the campaign and the creators of the game. Thank you for watching.